Assalamu alaikum and welcome to a special episode of The Audit. My name is Zeeshan Salahuddin and I lead the Center for Regional and Global Connectivity at Tabadlab. The Audit is a Tabadlab podcast that looks at Pakistan's bilateral relations with key partners around the world. In this inaugural podcast season for The Audit, we are looking at Pakistan's relations with the US, specifically its various confrontations, areas of cooperation, and the complexities of the relationship as they have unfolded over the last 75 years and where this relationship might be headed. 2 episodes of The Audit have already been put out. This special episode, I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Michael Kugelman of the Wilson Center, who is with us here today. One of the most salient analytical minds when it comes to Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and their relationship with the US. Michael, welcome to the podcast. Perhaps if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, it's great to be here with you. It's great to be at the Tabadlab offices. Great to meet you. So I have been at the Wilson Center think tank in Washington, D.C. For more than 15 years, managing our portfolio on Pakistan as well as India and Afghanistan. We recently launched a new South Asia Institute, which I'll be heading. And one of the newest initiatives to be housed in that institute, is a new Pakistan fellowship, which is going to build on the many years of work we've done on Pakistan. And I think the way I like to describe my work on Pakistan and the Wilson Center's work more broadly is that we apply a broad lens to Pakistan. We like to look at the country through a more nuanced, broader fashion than many others in DC tend to do.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I do appreciate you taking the time to be with us here today and to give us some of your views about how the relationship has unfolded over the last 75 years, but more critically, really over the last 20 years, as cooperation between the two countries has been shaped by the conflict to Pakistan's west. I think at this point in time, there's really no conversation in Pakistan that we can have without really talking about the floods and the climate-related disasters that are now going to increasingly affect this particular part of the world. We've seen tremendous devastation. The numbers are just staggering. We have 33 million people that have been affected, of which 22 million cannot afford basic food necessities. We have close to 1,400 people that have died as a direct result of the floods. There is going to be far-ranging consequences for infrastructure devastation, for the health sector, for the polio program, for education, for security-related matters. I mean, it's the kind of effect that these floods are going to have had and are going to have over the next months and potentially years is just tremendous. Now, the US has allocated close to $30 million in terms of relief efforts. There's also now a 10-day air corridor that has been opened to sort of fly in some very critical supplies. China has pledged quite a bit of money. But the thing that we always see in situations like these is that when these kinds of floods and natural calamities happen, the bulk of the focus remains on immediate humanitarian aid and effect. And in the process of that, both from external donors who are trying to reach out and help and our own internal metrics, the long-term thinking doesn't really come into play. Can you walk us through why is it that past the initial humanitarian push, despite the fact that Pakistan is not really responsible or not as much responsible for the global climate change effects, not much care or attention is given to how do we solve this problem for this part of the world for the long term?
Absolutely. It's a great question to start off with. Let me just give one caveat, which I meant to give earlier, that I am, and I like to tell Pakistani audiences this, I'm here from Washington, an American in Pakistan, but I'm not with the U.S. government. So what I say, my views don't represent those of the U.S. government. They're my own independent views, so that we all know. So no, absolutely, these floods, it's amazing that back in 2010, as you would well know, so many here and beyond were talking about seeing the worst floods Pakistan had ever seen, and the UN Secretary General back in 2010 said the UN had never responded to a natural disaster as catastrophic as those floods, and yet these floods are so much worse, which I think it's so hard to get our heads wrapped around the scale. But to your question, it's notable that in the past the U.S. has played a pretty significant role in flood recovery, not just flood recovery, but natural disaster assistance. going back to the 2010 floods, which of course happened at a moment when the US was at the height of its surge in Afghanistan. So it was fairly easy logistically to bring in many military helicopters into Pakistan to evacuate people. And that's what happened back then. And you go back to the earthquake in 2005, you also had a significant amount of US recovery efforts back then. So in that sense, we're just seeing a repeat of history with this very large US response. So I think it's notable to have such a large interagency effort. In recent days, we had top leaders from USAID as well as from State Department and Department of Defense, the NSC, and of course CENTCOM had been here as well. So I think that sort of signifies just how much the US wants to be involved in bringing assistance. But you're absolutely right. After the immediate rescue efforts are done, then not just the US, but the international assistance, it sort of goes away, so to speak. And I think it gets to the issue of what responsibility does the international community have to a country like Pakistan, which, as you say, is not a major contributor to global emissions, but it has to pay one of the biggest prices because of its own climate vulnerability. And I've actually advocated, I'm not the only one, for the world to essentially make that sacrifice and recognize that, yeah, it may be a hard sell to commit significant amounts of long-term assistance to Pakistan to focus on climate adaptation and mitigation efforts. Pakistan, its global image isn't very good. There's a lot of donor fatigue. There's been a lot of donor fatigue for a long time. We've heard about donor fatigue for years, but now today you're looking at the crisis in Ukraine, you're looking at the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, you're looking at the often forgotten humanitarian crisis in Yemen, you're looking at the looming famine in Somalia, and so many more. So why Pakistan? I think it's a hard sell, but I think it gets to the issue of the world there's an onus. There's a responsibility on the international community, and particularly the top polluters, which does not only include Western countries, it includes China as well. Let's be very honest. Those countries really do need to step up. And final point on this, I do think that it's useful to paint this from a stability lens as well, in the sense that climate change effects can be destabilizing. And for a country like the US, which views stability as a top interest, not its only interest, but as a top interest in Pakistan and the region, I think there's something to be said for looking at ways that it can try to make a better effort to foolproof Pakistan in terms of climate resilience and so on, not just to give back for its own pollution and the impact that's had in Pakistan, but also it will serve US interests to do that as well over the longer term.
Absolutely, Michael. And I think that little point that you raised about how perhaps the security and lens is also something that we should look at. I think that's something that has now come up in multiple realms, right? It has come up in terms of the political and constitutional crisis that Pakistan has gone through. It has come up in the very recent and ongoing economic crisis that is only going to get further exacerbated by the floods, the damages for which at this point, the lower estimate is close to $20 billion, and it's only expected to climb as we continue to sort of match up and see the level of damage that these floods have caused. And then, of course, the climate change conversation itself. I guess my question there is, there's been a lot of debate recently about the shift in geopolitical realities across the world. And the new word that has come up that people seem to use quite often now is geoeconomics. Pakistan has a very precarious position in this entire dynamic because by virtue of the instability in the economic arena, the devastation brought about by climate vulnerability, the internal political struggles, Pakistan is not really in a position to antagonize anyone, particularly key partners like the US, like China. And the biggest conflict that exists within the geopolitical space does exist between those two countries. You and I spoke a little bit earlier about, how things are seemingly only escalating with Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the warship exercises, the fact that China has now pulled out of 8 key conversations with the US. How does Pakistan, in a situation like this, maintain its status quo and its good working relationship with both countries and walk that tightrope, considering it can't really antagonize anyone?
Yeah, it's a fair point. And, one cannot emphasize enough just how prime of a factor U.S.-China competition is in U.S. foreign policy calculations. And, I remember when the Biden administration took over, there were some critics of Biden, especially on the Republican side, that had said, he's going to be a dove on China. Things are going to change. But he's gone in the other direction.
Yes.
And it's been a repeat of Trump. The fact that he invited the Taiwan de facto ambassador to his inauguration. No U.S. president had ever done that before. That sent a big signal right there. And of course, also when Blinken had characterized what was happening in Xinjiang as genocide, that's also huge. So absolutely, this is such a key question. And I think that certainly the tensions that emerged in U.S.-Pakistan relations during the last few months of Imran Khan's rule with his allegations, which I know we'll get to, that I think put the U.S.-Pakistan relationship at a difficult spot at a moment when Pakistan could not afford for it to be in a difficult spot. And that, of course, was before the floods, but Pakistan was already experiencing all kinds of other problems. But, my sense, it's interesting. I don't think from Washington's perspective, I don't think that the U.S. government has wanted Pakistan to choose a side, so to speak. My sense is that the U.S. has, if you look at U.S. policy in South Asia more broadly, I think that we see in recent months the U.S. positioning itself where it's been trying to deepen its relations with countries around South Asia to try to encourage them to move further away from China and closer to India. But that dynamic is not in place with Pakistan, in that the U.S. recognizes that Pakistan's relationship with China is very close, and that's not going to change. But I think that we're seeing the U.S. try to figure out ways to navigate its relationship with Pakistan, even within that constraint posed by Pakistan-China relations. And, I remember, well, you'll remember the speech, I guess an infamous speech that Alice Wells made at the Wilson Center almost 3 years ago, where she criticized CPEC. Many remember the first part of the speech when she criticized CPEC. But the second part of the speech was where she was laying out a vision for U.S. investment, for greater U.S. investment in Pakistan, using what she described as a more equitable, transparent model for investment. So, she was not saying that CPEC should end. She would have liked to see that, but she was making a pitch for the U.S. to counter Chinese investment. That's the term that you hear frequently in the context of Indo-Pacific policy and all that. Not contain. We're not seeing U.S. efforts to contain China, but to counter it. So I think that there is a desire for, and this was the case with the Trump administration, it's the case with the Biden administration, to try to look at the relationship with Pakistan as something that can work despite those constraints posed by China. And I think for Pakistan, indeed, it has a strong incentive to ensure that relations with both work. And I think a big question, which maybe we'll go into, is how can Pakistan generate agency in the sense that how could it try to position itself as a useful player vis-a-vis the U.S. and China? And I think I really think there is something to be said for that in terms of the mediating role.
Yeah, that was exactly going to be my next question. But to your last point, I think, and I apologize if I'm butchering the last name, but I believe the gentleman's name is Derek Chollet, who was one of the advisors to Secretary Blinken. I think in a recent statement, one of the things that he said was that it does not want countries in the world to have to choose between, the major powers, but for them to have a choice, which goes back to the entire argument about it's not containment, it's actually... And so I agree with you in that regard. But I do think that there is a historical precedent where Pakistan has been leveraged in the past. And I'm very specifically speaking about, of course, of Kissinger's visit back in the 70s, back when that initial bridge was built between Beijing and DC, and it was built through Karachi. Why is it that Pakistan is not seen as that interlocutor? And what can our politicians, what can our political elite do in order to position Pakistan to create, as you said, the word that you used very rightly so, agency, in order for Pakistan to be able to play that role in a bigger capacity and to sort of try and see how some of these escalations at the epicenter of which exists Pakistan in this region can be de-escalated?
No, it's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up. It's something that I've thought about myself. I think to answer your question, why the U.S. has not looked at Pakistan as a nation that could play that mediation role vis-a-vis China. Yeah, I think that for even as intense as the competition between the U.S. and China had become, there were still direct channels. I mean, it was still possible for the U.S. and China to engage on high levels when they wanted to. And when Biden took over, he had written in a foreign affairs essay when he was still a candidate, he had said that he would encourage engagement with China where our interests dictated. But the problem is, in recent weeks, we've seen not a collapse of the U.S.-China relationship, but we've indeed seen a cutoff in engagement, even in areas that would seem to be safer, in non-security areas. So that gets me to your very important question. And I think, if there's a game changer here, it would be in the realm of climate change, right? And we know that the US wants to talk about China with climate change. We know that how important it is for the administration, the fact that Biden appointed John Kerry to essentially be his climate change czar, having him housed in the NSC. That's an indication of how seriously he takes it. There was a lot of discussion right when the administration was taking office that Kerry himself wanted to suspend competition with China in order to fully focus on climate change discussions. But China, as I understand it, has now said that there's not going to be any discussions on climate change issues. So here is where I think Pakistan can play a role at a moment when even one of the big issues that the US would like to discuss with China is not something that can be discussed at a moment when we really recognize just how critical the challenge climate change is. We know how critical and relevant climate change is for Pakistan. Why can't Pakistan perhaps be seen as the player that tries to encourage the US, Washington, and Beijing to have re-incentivize their interest in a way that they would be willing to come together and start discussing climate change? So I don't know how much support that view would get in Washington, in official Washington, but I think that it makes a whole lot of sense.
Yep. And I think the potential for at least exploring that conversation is certainly there. There shouldn't be any stones left unturned, especially considering that these two great powers, the competition is not necessarily good for the world overall. However, if it was more cooperative in nature, then I think it would be a game changer, especially for the global South. Let's pivot a little bit. I think there's one aspect of this conversation and one key player that no conversation in Pakistan can sort of go without, and that is our neighbor to the west, Afghanistan. Now, the war on terror in Afghanistan has wrapped up. The US has left. It's been more than a year since the Taliban have taken over, more than a year since the last C-130 left with the last of the soldiers. Things have happened in Afghanistan since that have effectively ensured that the recognition issue is not really going to come to the forefront. Principal among them is the treatment of females, female education. Zawahiri assassination, I think, was a big point, and a smaller point, of course, is the fact that Salahuddin is playing the interlocutor between the GOP and the TTP, and both of these incidents, of course, are in direct violation of the Doha Agreement. So as far as Afghanistan is concerned, Pakistan has been viewed very much through a very security-centric lens for a very, very long time. And despite the fact that the exit has happened, I feel like that lens, while needs changing, is not really seeing much of a shift. In fact, very recently, the conversation between General Bajwa and General Kurilla was about CT and those kinds of cooperation, because counterterrorism in Afghanistan is going to remain a big topic with groups like the IKSP, the IMU, Al-Qaeda, and other groups operating inside of Afghanistan. So what is it that can be done to shift a little bit away from viewing Pakistan only through the security lens when it comes to Afghanistan, especially considering the fact, and this is a figure that I forget the gentleman, but somebody quoted in a conference recently, that 91% of Pakistan's borders are countries that are not necessarily friendly towards Pakistan. And the whole idea of Pakistan continuing the CT cooperation with the US only antagonizes our friends on the Afghan side further.
Right. That's a great point. This has always been a challenge. And I would argue that if you get outside of official government channels, I think there's a lot more prospects for looking at the US-Pakistan relationship through a non-security lens. I mean, as you would know, educational cooperation is a huge achievement. It's long been a huge achievement in US-Pakistan relations. The fact that it's a statistic that the US Embassy oftentimes repeats for good reason, that the Fulbright program, Pakistan is the biggest one throughout Fulbright.
Yep.
That's been going on for many years. We have a US-Pakistan Business Council, which is never going to be as big as the US-India Business Council, but you've got some major American companies that have been in that for a while and have been investing in Pakistan for quite some time. So clearly, if you get outside of official government channels, there's more support for the idea of broader cooperation with Pakistan. And the diaspora is also critical. I mean, the Pakistani diaspora is now the second fastest growing Asian diaspora in the US. And it's a diaspora that I would argue is not necessarily the most organized, but there are some factions of it that are very keen to figure out how to, for instance, promote more cooperation between the two sides in the areas of high tech, IT, that type of thing. So there's a lot of potential there. But I think that part of the problem is that the US, even though it has an alliance with Pakistan, it's had several different alliances with Pakistan. There's been strategic dialogue. There's been some talk about strategic relationship. It's not really a strategic relationship. At the end of the day, it's a transactional relationship, which for many people is a bad word. It shouldn't be, because most U.S. relationships are transactional, based on what happens to serve U.S. interests at any one point. And at the end of the day, unfortunately, the U.S. has tended to look at Pakistan through a security lens because it believes that its main interests in Pakistan tend to be dictated by security issues, which have ranged over the time from partnering with Pakistan to fight communism, to fighting terrorism, to worrying about terrorism in Pakistan, and so on and so forth. So it's going to be difficult to get away from that, but I actually am heartened. I mean, I think we've seen in recent months, and even going back into when Imran Khan was still in office, we've seen significant scale-ups in non-security cooperation. I think health is a big example. I mean, as you would know, though I think many here in Pakistan don't realize this, the U.S. has sent more COVID pandemic vaccines to Pakistan than any other country. And the new ambassador here, Ambassador Blom, one of his first moves was to set up a new bilateral dialogue on health. That's great. And I think with these floods, of course, the catastrophic impacts on health and public health would make that bilateral health dialogue appear to be something that could really shine, so to speak, right now. So, if you're looking for silver linings out of the pandemic and especially the floods, I think that those may provide more opportunities for non-security cooperation between the U.S. and Pakistan. But certainly, old habits and old views die hard in Washington at a moment when, quite frankly, there's not enough bandwidth to do a comprehensive Pakistan policy review and think about how to really broaden the relationship beyond security. But I am heartened by what we've seen over the last few months.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right as far as the COVID-19 vaccines are concerned. I think the vast majority of the population is actually not aware of this, which is also a bit of a commentary on the PR machine that exists, not just on the US side, but I guess also on the Pakistan side. And I think the health cooperation, especially with Ambassador Blom here now, is critical for the floods. Some of the numbers that we've seen regarding, especially with maternal and childcare health coming out of the floods is just staggering. I mean, there's somewhere around 660,000 women that are pregnant that are part of the 33 million affected. And within the month of September alone, for example, we're expected, 73,000 of those women are expected to give birth in extremely squalid, extremely difficult conditions and environments with floodwaters still receding and them not really having access to their own homes. So I think health is absolutely a key area. Another area, of course, is exports. The U.S. remains one of Pakistan's, not one of the biggest export destination for Pakistan. There's close to 3,500 items, I believe, that are on a list that go duty-free. But I do feel, and this is a conversation we've been having internally at Tabadlab as well, along with our partners and various non-resident fellows, that this aspect of it, the export aspect of it, the transactional or however you want to call it aspect of it can be dramatically enhanced and improved. And I guess that sort of really leads me to my two-part next question, which is, what are some of these low-hanging fruits, in addition to health, in addition to the COVID-19 vaccine and post-pandemic related support, that the two countries can sort of focus on and sort of do a little bit of more of a stitch up, especially considering that temperatures have been raised. And the second part of that question, I guess, is why is it that Pakistan cannot be viewed as a normal country or treated as one? I mean, you've answered some of that question, but I just very specifically wanted to use the word normal, because Pakistan is not really ever treated as, a bilateral nation to just have a relationship with.
Yeah, so I think if you go back to the themes that figured in the strategic dialogue that was in place between the U.S. and Pakistan for a period of time, starting in 2009, 2010, whenever it came out, it was suspended several times. It hasn't resumed for a few years. But I think if you want to talk about low-hanging fruit, I think there are a number of key useful areas there. I mean, some of them we've already talked about, but something like energy, something like climate change, women's issues, education, I see that all as low-hanging fruit, just because there's a pretty long legacy. Again, this is something that may not necessarily be known by large audiences here or in the U.S. There is a pretty long legacy of U.S.-Pakistan cooperation in those areas. I mean, the U.S. has long been a top development provider to Pakistan in terms of development assistance. And so you have that legacy. It should be easy to resurface that, so to speak. And I think that climate change really that has to be seen as low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, there's no better wake-up call of how important this issue is than given what happened here with the floods in recent weeks. And the U.S. is clearly committed to help in that regard. As we discussed earlier, the key is to go beyond immediate assistance and think about the longer game. And so I think that it's a logical place for the two to work. And I was making that argument previously when you had a prime minister here who appeared to be committed to climate change mitigation, even though one could argue of whether actual policies match that. But even now, I would think there's going to be multi-partisan support in Pakistan within the broader political elite that there needs to be more focus on climate change. And that's a top priority for the Biden administration. So maybe this could entail setting up some type of new dialogue on climate change. I mean, we have the bilateral health dialogue. Why not one on climate change as well? It doesn't have to be at the highest levels. It doesn't have to be minister level. Even if it's more mid-level, just to have the two sides talking, just to get some smart people from both countries and governments on both sides talking about what could be done, what would work, what are the biggest needs here, what are the biggest areas that the U.S. can assist. I think that could be a big start right there.
Yep.
So to your question about why the U.S. has never seen Pakistan as a normal country, yeah, it's a fair point. I would argue that one could make the same argument about many countries, because I go back to what I said before, that there's relatively few countries that the U.S. looks at in terms of pursuing a relationship with these countries for the sake of pursuing the relationship. You have to look at what I would describe as the special relationships that the U.S. has with a very select few number of countries. One would be Israel, another would be the UK, Australia, Japan, some of the U.S. main treaty allies that it's been with for quite some time, Japan, some of its NATO partners. So there have been plenty of tensions with the UK and France, for sure. Very few countries that the U.S. is willing to look at just through the lens of those countries themselves and not through other things that are happening. I think part of the problem with Pakistan is that there are bad things, so to speak, perceived in Washington, bad things that have been happening in Pakistan that bear on U.S. interests. And that has then sort of taken attention away from a broader, deeper focus on the relationship. So, the problems with terrorism for many years here, the concerns for many years, though not as much now, about the safety of nuclear weapons. Those were two things that I think came to dominate the relationship in a big way from the perspective of the U.S. in terms of how Pakistan was perceived. And given that stability, it's hard to get away from the stability focus, so long as there were those concerns about nuclear issues and concerns about terrorism and the possible interplay between the two, that really, I think, made it difficult to situate the relationship in a broader way. And I emphasize, neither of those are perceived as bigger as concerns now as much as they were in the past, for sure. But for many years, that was the case. But I think that now you have a good opportunity right now, I think, to try to reorient the lens to Pakistan in the sense that, we could talk about the resurgence of the Pakistani Taliban, but we don't have terrorism threats like you used to.
No.
The U.S. is no longer in Afghanistan, so it doesn't need to be quite as concerned about the likes of the Haqqani network and so on, and its relationship to Pakistan. We're seeing this momentum for focusing on non-security cooperation. There's new bilateral dialogues being launched. It's been a while since we've had that type of momentum. But so I think that there's an opportunity to look at Pakistan as so-called normal country. But I would say this, that for many years, U.S. officials have looked at Pakistan as an important country in its own right because of its location, because of its relationships with the likes of China, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, its population, which of course is young and big. These are all, I think, reasons that the U.S. has identified to engage with Pakistan just for the sake of engaging with Pakistan, or at least recognizing that it's an important country in its own right, and not because of other sort of exogenous factors, so to speak. So we could be seeing a bit of a shift in that lens. But I'm with you. I certainly hope that there's a shift, because I think Pakistan deserves better. That it should be perceived by Washington for the country that it is.
Yep. My last question to you, I think a part of that you've already answered, so I won't go through the entire question, because I think there is something to be said about the political vitriol and acrimony that exists inside of Pakistan. not just in terms of the coalition government actively fighting against an individual who is very actively raising temperatures on the street, has huge popularity. I would in fact argue at this point that perhaps Imran Khan is the most popular he has ever been. And truly has become, sort of the voice of the masses in many ways, and of segments of society that we didn't think would come out onto the streets. But those issues, because of fiscal pressures, now also exist within the coalition government and might even affect intra-party dynamics within the ruling specific one party. And all of that, of course, also has a bearing on foreign policy, relationships with the US, relationships with China, how things are approached. But and I think it's appropriate that throughout this conversation, the one thing that has kept coming up, especially in light of the floods, is the increased need for climate change, and that being sort of this galvanizing glue, this cement that sort of brings everything together. One of the conversations, or one of the ideas that Tabadlab has been speaking about and trying to sort of pursue, is this whole idea of the intersection of climate change vulnerability and debt vulnerability, and how one of the things that needs to happen, or at the very least there needs to be a push for it, is that there needs to be debt restructuring and or forgiveness for Pakistan for it to be able to funnel some of that money and some of those resources into climate financing, more specifically for adaptation, not necessarily mitigation for obvious reasons. But that's what is the need of the hour. Do you feel that is something that bilaterals or multilaterals will be willing to consider? What are some of the things that Pakistan can do to sort of influence that? And is that even a fair ask?
Yeah, it certainly is a hard sell. It's hard enough, as we discussed, to get the international community to buy into committing to longer-term, open-ended climate adaptation mitigation support to Pakistan, though it's very much worth doing. When you get to the issue of debt forgiveness, debt restructuring, that gets really tricky as well, just because of Pakistan's own record when it comes to taking on so many loans and its indebtedness, which of course has sources across the board. You and I both know that it's not just because of Chinese debt. It goes much deeper than that. In fact, Chinese debt is not a major contributor to Pakistan's overall debt. Look, the last prime minister, Imran Khan, he tried to make debt forgiveness into a big issue. He was championing that on the world stage. He was going before the UN and calling for that. And I don't think he got very far. And so if he didn't get very far and he was making that a big priority, that suggested it could be even tougher now for this current government here, which is burdened by so many different challenges. I do think that the floods perhaps give Pakistan its strongest argument yet, though, that it's time to sort of rethink that. But
the window is short.
Exactly, yeah, the window is short, and I do fear that within the coming weeks, that window of opportunity could shut, because unfortunately you're going to see much less media attention on the floods. You're going to see much less international donor assistance to floods, which would not be a good thing. So, the moment is now. And I think that with, of course, the UNGA meetings coming up this month, I think that your prime minister will have an opportunity. I understand he'll be traveling to New York to give Pakistan's remarks. That could be an opportunity for him to put that on the table and to get that conversation going at the UN. Certainly, it's worth bringing up with bilateral partners, including the US, and certainly partners in the EU and so on. But again, the question is, what argument would Pakistan make? What would be its big pitch? That's the question. But I think that this is certainly, if there was ever a time to have that conversation, it's now.
Absolutely. Michael, there's a big difference between watching you on television, reading your Twitter threads, and having a conversation with you in person. I must say I'm very humbled and in absolute awe of the manner in which you frame some of these issues and how you analyze some of these issues, and very grateful for you sparing the time today. We spoke quite a bit about the floods today. I do want to flag with the audience that the next episode for the audit is specifically focusing on the floods. In fact, we went back and interviewed General Nagara, who was overseeing some of those operations, Ambassador Ann Patterson, at the time, as well as General Nadeem on the Pakistani side, who was looking at flood relief efforts from the Pakistani perspective. And it has a lot of information about what we learned in 2010, what we did not apply, and how this might unfold in the coming years, because these floods are now no longer a one-time event. This is going to continue to happen and continue to exacerbate. That being said, Thank you very much, Michael. I'm very grateful for your time and for your analysis. It's a tremendous opportunity for Tabadlab and people here, as well as our audience, to learn from you and to be able to tap into some of the strategic thinking that goes into some of these very critical, key, and salient questions. So thank you for being here. I appreciate your time. This has been another episode of The Audit, a special episode with Mr. Michael Kugelman of the Wilson Center. We'll see you on the next one.